I call this talk spiritual report cards. And I have been running away from failure ever since I was first aware there was even such a thing as a report card. I couldn't imagine anything worse than getting an F, the humiliation, the disgrace. So I made sure that I never did. I actually lived through my school years believing that my grade point average and my self-worth were one and the same thing. Even though ultimately a 4.0 GPA was flimsy proof indeed of any kind of self-worth, still a string of A's did offer some momentary consolation and camouflage, if you will, for my true failure as a boy, as a straight boy doing straight boy things, not like the other boys at all. It leaves me to wonder how many of us still live our lives as if there will be a report card at the end, as if we will be judged ultimately on the meaning we made of our lives or of our work, or how many things we acquired, or how much money we made, or what kind of a parent or grandparent were we. Or conversely, living with the bone-chilling fear that I must have been absent that day, unaware that this particular moral challenge would be on the final exam, and I blew it. Sharon is wrestling with that very fear. She's facing the imminent end of her life from ovarian cancer. Michael, I think I've been a good person and I've lived a decent life, but I've made my mistakes and I have my regrets, big ones. What if I don't get into heaven? As if she will be judged ultimately on her resume and not on, say, the love that's in her heart or what she learned along the way, if she's even to be judged at all. My grandmother, Barbara, my dad's mom, was one tough cookie. She was so tough, in fact, that her standard reply to the greeting, "How are you?" was, "I'm just as mean as usual." "I don't believe in failure," she would say. "There's no such thing, because you can always learn something." It's a pretty commonly held perception, particularly among those given to positive thinking as a way of navigating through life, and certainly within the mythos of American notions of success. But what I found lacking in my grandmother's declaration was compassion. If I were brokenhearted that I didn't get the thing I wanted more than anything else, devastated really after working so hard to get it, I really didn't hear, "Well, I'm not going to feel sorry for you because you're going to learn something through this." That wasn't helpful at all in the moment, even if in time it proved to be true. Compassion, after all, only means to be with suffering, to be with it, not to fix it or correct it or advise it or compare it. It's not a small or easy thing. I would venture to say that authentic compassion for others and for oneself might be the one true great healer. And yet it's not an attribute I've ever seen on any report card or any measuring stick for success. At the same time, I resonate deeply with the writings of Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. In the end, everything can be taken from a man, but this one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. So there it is. Maybe it is ultimately up to us to write that final grade, to call it a success or a failure, to cast that final verdict. But I find myself struggling with this all too human urge to cast any verdict at all, this need to see life through a dualistic lens of win and lose and success and failure. What if it's not so simple as that? What if it's not so clear-cut as that? In the early 90s, I had a design business, and at the time, a big economic recession hit Los Angeles, and my business fell off to zero. I needed to do something quick. As a stopgap strategy, I took what is called the CBEST test, and I got an emergency teaching credential, and I was hired to be a substitute school teacher in Inglewood Unified School District. Now, Inglewood at the time was a highly disadvantaged minority community in Los Angeles, and this was a few weeks after the Rodney King uprisings in LA. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but soon enough, I discovered I did not have the constitution to face those schools every day. So on my off days, I volunteered at Project Angel Food, delivering home-cooked meals to homebound people with AIDS. These were the peak years of the AIDS crisis before the drug cocktails. I also got involved with the fledgling volunteer AIDS hospice group called Project Nightlight. But at the time, I felt like an abject failure, the loser of the world. No one could convince me otherwise. I assiduously avoided friends who might call me, dare to ask the unthinkable question, so what are you doing these days? What's more, I was convinced that I was somehow a spiritual failure, that God had somehow dispensed all the qualities needed to live a successful life to everyone else except me. Firmly attached to that idea. And yet, when I look back on that point in time now, I see it as the pivot point that made this part of my life possible, that directed me, opened the door toward this pathway toward chaplaincy. Though it would occur many years later, it's a profession that has made sense of the whole mess of the journey so far, and one that I love so much. So am I to look back on that point in time now and call it a blessing, a success, hurting so badly that I wanted to die? The older I get, I find the less patience I have with that black and white, either or kind of thinking. In the world of cancer, the stakes are much higher when it comes to our perceptions of success and failure. If this diagnosis means the imminent end of my physical body, does that mean that Western medicine failed? My doctor failed. This drug trial failed. My acupuncturist failed. My vegan diet failed. My positive affirmations failed. My prayers failed. God failed me. I failed God. These profound experiences of failure are not just the province of patients. Over the years, I've walked beside dozens and dozens of folks left behind, the bereaved, and they too wrestle almost uniformly with profound experiences of failure. If I hadn't spent so much time at work, I could have taken better care of her. She might still be here. If it weren't for my depression and anxiety, I know I caused her so much distress, and that's why the breast cancer came back. It's my fault. If I just insisted that he go to the doctor sooner, why didn't we get a second opinion? This need to cast a final verdict, either way, I find, seldom leaves room for there to be a verdict of not guilty. Deanna is living with an aggressive colon cancer. She's also deeply rooted in a faith system that might best be described as New Age, believing she can create her reality as she imagines it through positive affirmation and prayer and belief. Up until now, that faith system has worked rather well for her. She's found herself a wonderful mate, continues to enjoy success in her business. She's a planner and a goal setter. She likes goals with nice, measurable outcomes. So each win only solidifies and deepens her faith that much more. How could it be otherwise? But now the tables have turned and the disease is progressing. That whole paradigm of goal setting becomes far more challenging, even a little murky. If cure is medically off the table, what is the most she can hope for? Just more time living with chronic cancer. What's more, she feels like a spiritual failure. Michael, I guess my faith wasn't strong enough. My affirmations weren't powerful enough. My prayers weren't positive enough. It's my fault. Over 20 years ago, I was covering an overnight on-call shift at UCLA Medical Center. It was late on a Sunday night, and I was paged to come up to the ICU. An elderly woman, the matriarch of a large African-American family, was very near death, and her family wanted some support and a prayer. So I offered them that, and I left. A few hours later, I was paged to come back up to the unit because the woman had passed. And now the family just wanted company while they waited for their pastor to arrive. Once he arrived, he took one look at the scene and said, "It looks like you all didn't pray hard enough." As if this loving family had failed their mother, and as if death itself is a failure. And if that's true, all of us are guaranteed an F on our final report card. Spiritual success, spiritual failure, these are tricky concepts, again, with this either or kind of thinking. Over the years, I've walked beside countless folks who would profess to have a deep faith of one stripe or another, and many who would say they have no faith at all, but all with a common longing for strength. I wish I believed more. I wish my faith were stronger. When we tease that apart and say, what do you really mean by that strong faith? It usually means certainty. I want to know that I'm going to beat this cancer. I want to know this drug trial is going to work. I want to know I have the best oncologist possible. I want to know that the Lord's got my back. Paul Tillich, a German-American famous theologian, says the opposite of faith isn't doubt, it's certainty. If I'm certain, I'm not really walking in faith anymore, am I? Faith might better be described by me as a willingness to step off into the unknown with my doubts and fears in tow and continuing to walk anyway, with curiosity, with patience, with humility, with hope, with compassion, even for my own experience of failure. With Deanna, who loved to set nice, tidy goals, we looked at what another kind of goal might be that does not have such a measurable outcome. What about a goal of coming to peace with doubt, with uncertainty, coming to terms with her own powerlessness, giving herself the grace to be a human being? Over these last few years of the pandemic and all of the extreme measures we had to endure, it almost doesn't seem real now. But there were many among us, myself included, who sought to redefine what we meant by spiritual success because the times seemed to have demanded it. And there have been those eternally optimistic spiritual folks who likened all of these measures to a golden opportunity to hit the reset button for life on planet Earth, to refine and distill all the extraneous down to what is absolutely essential. Not me. I grieved. I never realized how much of a people person I am, how much of an extrovert, that for me, real human connection, contact is like oxygen to me. That kind of connectedness might even come close to the meaning of life itself. So much so that for me, sitting in a darkened, sold-out theater, knee to knee with strangers, anticipating being moved to tears or laughter by the same humanity on display on a stage, becomes a religious rite, a ritual. Just as it is to gather with my dancing chums on Saturday afternoon in the same dance studio and dance to the same music in front of the same mirror, and afterward get to partake in Holy Communion, complaining about everything that hurts. Just as it is to travel to some faraway land and get lost in some alleyway among a bunch of locals, many of whom may never have even heard of Los Angeles. Just as it is to hug someone in trouble, a loved one, a friend, family member, a patient, a stranger. So much so that when these experiences were off the table, remember, off the table indefinitely, maybe even for the rest of my life, a part of me, I'm embarrassed to say, wondered whether life was worth living. And in those moments, I would call myself a spiritual failure and give myself an F. By contrast, Bernadette is 31 years old, and she lives with this unrelenting curiosity and humor and acceptance of life. She seems to live in the place of, gee, I wonder what that would be like. So much so that after her diagnosis and she began her chemotherapy and her beautiful head of red hair began to fall out, we had that conversation I often have generally with women when they meet that crucible. Some will choose to preemptively shave their heads as a self-empowering gesture. Some might choose to make a lighthearted ritual out of it, dye their hair green and invite friends over for a shaving party. No, Bernadette said, I just think it'd be really interesting to see what it'd be like to have your hair fall out. And when her treatment was complete and that year had come to a close, we were reflecting together on the year that had passed. And she said, you know, Michael, all in all, I'd have to say, pretty good year after all. Bernadette, in a year that includes a cancer diagnosis, chemotherapy, radical double mastectomy, radiation, reconstruction surgery, if that doesn't make for a bad year, what on earth would? Oh, I don't know, losing my sense of humor, I guess. A spirit like that cannot be broken. I walked beside Grace over the last 6 years of her life. She had lived a life of dizzying twists and turns, both personally and professionally, zigzagging her way across the country. I asked her once, Grace, if there were a young person in your life, maybe a grandchild or something, came up to you and said, Graham, what's one piece of advice you'd have for somebody like me after having lived such an interesting life? She didn't take much time at all to respond. When the time comes, she said, be ready to go. She actually echoes Joseph Campbell as he describes the hero's journey. In order to be a hero, one must be prepared for when the moment comes. That might be the point of all spirituality, he said. Donna and Lois had shared the last 40-some years of their lives together, both in their 80s, so at ease with each other, so devoted to one another, creating family in a culture that is really hostile to two women calling themselves a family. For the previous 7 years, Lois had been living with ovarian cancer, and as the disease progressed, she chose to take advantage of aid and dying medication for when the going got to be too rough. She was a vibrant, no-nonsense gal, engaging, who was way more interested in hearing what I had to say than telling her story one more time. Sometimes it was hard to know just how much suffering she was carrying because she did it with such grace. Though thoroughly contemporary, knew her way around a computer, she was also steeped in old school virtues like letter writing and sending thank you notes. One Saturday night, she leaned over and told Donna, honey, I think the time's come and I'm going to take the medication tomorrow morning. Donna said, well, if it's that bad, sweetheart, why not take it tonight? I can't. I got too many things to do. What do you have to do that's so important? I have a couple bills to pay and some birthday cards to send and some thank you notes to write. I'll help you do that, Donna said. So after 80 plus years on planet Earth, she spent the very last night of her life with intention, sitting around the dining table with her beloved Donna, engaged in the most mundane activities, but activities that are nevertheless rooted in kindness and consideration and connectedness. That is an image of spiritual success in my book. The next morning, she got up, put on her best red silk pajamas, and said, I guess I might as well go out in style. If there were such a thing as a spiritual report card, I'd give them both an A+. As I would to Bernadette for that incomparable curiosity and humor and acceptance, as I would to Grace for her unbelievable mastery at just riding the wave of life. Spiritual strength, spiritual success, strong faith, you bet, and not a shred of certainty inside. If there is such a thing as a spiritual report card, I imagine it's rooted in our capacity for compassion, for others, for ourselves, for this moment, exactly as it is and as it is not. Coming to peace with our own ultimate powerlessness, and perhaps paradoxically finding a deeper sense of power in that. I'm a big documentary film fan. I remember in 1995, a wonderful Oscar-nominated documentary called Troublesome Creek. It's a story of a family farm in Iowa that had been in the family for generations, over 125 years. Russell and Mary continue to work the farm, though they're much older now, having raised their kids who have all grown up and moved away. But the farm is facing foreclosure because of a farming crisis. So it's all hands on deck. All the kids come back to Iowa to do what they can to save the family farm. We're given to believe it will kill mom and dad if they lose the farm and have to move into town. So you're kind of dying a little bit as you're watching them auction off the livestock and the farm equipment and their furniture. You see Mary stroking her Ethan Allen dining table. Oh, the Thanksgiving dinners I served at this table. Sold. They can't lose the farm. But they do. And to everyone's shock and amazement, they flourish. Russell's a new man, unencumbered by all of that backbreaking labor and nonstop worry. One of those guys that has those wild, untamed, bushy eyebrows. You think, what's up with the eyebrows, Russell? There he is in the barbershop, getting them all trimmed up, looking his best. I'll never forget the last line of the film. It's narrated by their daughter, Jean. Success and failure. Sometimes it's hard to tell which is which. Yes, it is. So be it.